October 1st, 2015 marks a change in the classification system that American physicians and hospitals use to record diseases of the patients they treat, from ICD-9 CM to ICD-10 CM. ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases. The ICD system traces its roots to the Middle Ages. It has been modified to accommodate changes in the understanding of diseases as well as other factors. The purpose of this documentary is to shed some light on how ICD came into being and how it has evolved over the centuries. The ICD-10 CM code specifically applies to the classification of diseases. Medical treatments, surgeries, pharmaceuticals, or other procedures performed by physicians are reported through different coding systems. The ICD-10 CM code is 7 digits long. The first character indicates the body system. The next two indicate the disease, and subsequent digits provide more specificity. The seventh digit indicates whether the treatment is for an initial encounter or subsequent one. The biggest differences between the 5-digit ICD-9 CM code and the 7-digit ICD-10 CM code are the use of an alpha character in the first position for the body system, the incorporation of which side of the body has the disease into the 6th digit, and the extension codes indicating the episode of care. How these codes are used to document diseases is best illustrated in this example of a patient who died in April of 2014.
My name is Kim, and let me tell you about my father. He was a big man in many ways, but especially in attitude and appetite. And like many men of his generation, he got more sedentary as he got older. He went from playing baseball to coaching baseball to watching baseball. He was at least 100 pounds overweight during his adult life, and it resulted in several chronic conditions, including diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and gout. He refused to follow any sort of diet to manage these conditions, and by his 80s, they had taken their toll. The result was uncontrolled diabetes and hypertension, resulting in end-stage kidney disease, but he refused dialysis. He did not want to be hooked up to a machine. My mother and I took him to the nephrologist on Wednesday, April 16th, and the doctor told him he had virtually no kidney function left. Easter was the following Sunday, and he told our family that he would consider being admitted to the hospital on Monday as long as he had had Easter dinner. Well, he never made it to Easter dinner because by Friday, April 18th, he was so ill he had to be taken to the hospital by ambulance. They performed emergency dialysis, but it was too late. The level of toxins in his blood caused his consciousness to drop, and he went into a coma. He died 6 days later on April 24th, 2014.
How we classify events, people, diseases, and causes of death can have an outsized impact on how we view the world and how we react to it. One example of how causes of death are classified is in the events of September 11, 2001. If you look at the reported number of murders in the U.S. from FBI statistics, they were about 24,000 in 1994 and declined more or less steadily until there were about 15,000 in 2002. However, a very specific footnote added to the number of murders in 2001 states that the murder and non-negligent homicides that occurred as a result of the events of September 11, 2001 are not included in this table. In other words, the people that died on 9/11 were not murdered as far as these statistics are concerned. Had they been included, the smooth trends indicating demographic changes and effective policing would have been interrupted with a 20% increase in the number of people killed. Another example of the importance of classification can be illustrated in how HIV/AIDS was reported in the 1980s. Before there was a code for reporting HIV/AIDS, there was no category for physicians to report this as a cause of death or disease. they may have used a code designating a skin lesion or miscellaneous immune deficiency. When the public demanded a better accounting of the transmission of the epidemic, separate codes were established to report HIV/AIDS, its manifestations, and laboratory results. After the introduction of a code, there is a spike in a reported disease since it was reported elsewhere prior to the introduction of the new code. Finally, the first motor vehicular accident resulting in death was reported on September 13, 1899. In the 1909 version of the list of causes of death was the classification for violent deaths due to horse-drawn vehicles. In 1919, a code summarized these deaths into traumatic death due to machines. By 1929, footnotes described accidents by different means of transport, including automobiles and motorcycles. By 1938, deaths in automobile accidents had their own category. So, as the technology in the real world changed, how these events were viewed and organized changed as well. As shown in the vehicular deaths example, the science of classification must deal with a process known as lumping and splitting. It describes the two camps of individuals involved in classification. The lumpers like to throw similar things into one big category, for example, traumatic death due to machines, whereas the splitters prefer to place examples into rigorously defined categories like death by automobile and death by motorcycle. Charles Darwin first used the terms lumpers and splitters in 1857 and applied them to people who were classifying different species. These terms have since been applied to biology, history, sociology, language classification, liturgical studies, and philosophy. Each group criticizes the other. Lumpers criticize splitters as creating overly complex structures without any underlying meaning. Splitters criticize lumpers as ignoring evidence that did not fit into their arguments. The arguments between the two groups can be seen in the discussion in 1919 between two opposing factions. The lumpers wanted to create a single code for typhoid, whereas the splitters wanted to differentiate typhoid from paratyphoid with a different classification. In the 1900 and 1909 versions of the causes of death, the first disease was fièvre typhoide, or typhoid fever. During the 1920 discussions, Professor Roget of France indicated that during the war, when we gave vaccinations for typhoid, that disease disappeared, but paratyphoid fever did not. This argument, among others, must have been persuasive enough because the subclassification of typhoid fever appears in the 1920 and subsequent categories. One could argue that there are a lot more diseases now than there were 100 years ago because we have a lot more ways to classify them, but that would not be correct. For example, the ICD-9-CM code for arthritis of the hip used to be reported as 715.35. This has been replaced in ICD-10-CM with designations for left hip, right hip, unspecified hip, and 12 others, depending on the source of the disease, whether it was bilateral arthritis, and others. So now there are 15 codes instead of one, but they are just allowing more specificity in designating the disease of the patients. In developing the classification, the needs of the lumpers and splitters both have to be considered. If you create too many categories, splitting, you don't have enough data to provide meaningful comparisons. On the other hand, if you have too few categories, lumping, you won't see important differences within the categories. The trend in disease classification has favored the splitters over the years. The initial number of 179 causes of death created at the first International Congress evolved to 4,000 causes of death or diseases in 1948. Since 1948's sixth revision of the ICD, the number of disease classifications has increased to 12,000, with ICD-9-CM and over 60,000 in ICD-10 CM. Looking back across time, the process of disease classification began over 500 years ago. There was some recording of causes of death in Italy in the Middle Ages, but most students of the history of medicine and disease point to the Bills of Mortality of London in the 1500s as the origin of the classification of diseases that we use today. Originally established under a charter granted by King James I, their original purpose was to determine how dangerous the bubonic plague was to the people that lived in London. In 1665, about 1/5 of London's population died of the plague. Bills of mortality were produced in London between 1532 and 1858. The first bills were obtained from members of the Worshipful Company of Parish Clerks. Causes of death were recorded by people who attended burials in their parishes.
The searchers, who are ancient matrons, go to where the dead corpse lies, and by viewing and inquiries, they determine by what disease or casualty the person died. They make their report to the parish clerk, and he, on Tuesday night, carries an account of all the burials and christenings happening that week to the clerk of the hall. On Wednesday, the general account is made up, printed, and published on Thursdays, and dispersed to several families, who will pay 4 shillings per annum for them.
While many of the causes of death reported would be understood today, aged, cold and cough, convulsion, fever, gangrene, many would not. Cut of the stone, jawfallen, imposthume, king's evil. The first person to take advantage of these published data was John Graunt. In 1662, he published a book, Natural and Political Observations Made Upon the Bills of Mortality. In it, he summarized the causes of death reported by each parish, and he estimated the probabilities of survival by age group. Already in the mid-19th century, social scientists were carping about the inaccuracies of data derived from the Bills of Mortality. Although it was by far the most comprehensive snapshot of daily life and death in England at the time, the Bills of Mortality were criticized because, in what may be the first example of healthcare fraud, the transcribers of the causes of death could be persuaded to alter a cause of death to a less controversial term. Some might prefer to have grief listed as the cause of death instead of French pox, the term used at the time for syphilis.
It shall be examined under what name of disease are recorded. The old women's searchers, after a cup of ale and the bribe of a 2-groat fee, cannot tell whether a person's emaciation were from a fever or an infection.
Another reason for questioning the accuracy of the data was the fact that only burials were reported, not deaths, and only burials in Church of England parishes, which would have excluded Catholics and Jews and people who died in hospitals. The parishes included didn't change from 1636, so as the metropolis of London grew between the 17th through the 19th centuries, the deaths from those areas were not included in the bills. The bills continued until the last one in September of 1858. Graunt's commentaries reflected the prejudices of his day. He makes pointed social commentary in his Observations in 1665. He contrasts the relative safety of London compared to Paris.
Few are murdered, not above 86 of the over 200,000 which have died of other diseases and casualties, whereas in Paris, few nights escape without their tragedy.
And comments on the obstetric conditions of the day.
In regular times, not more than 1 woman in 100 die in labor. Animals die even more seldom in their deliveries, not 1 in some thousands. What I have heard of the Irish women confirms this.
Graunt lost his house and possessions in a fire and ended up in bankruptcy. In 1674, he died of jaundice and liver disease at age 53. It is not known how his death would have been reported in the bills of mortality that he studied for so long. Under the bills of mortality, Kim's dad's cause of death would probably have been listed as aged. Beginning in the 17th century, a number of attempts would be made to create a more scientific basis to classify diseases, which was given the name of nosology, derived from the Greek nosos, for disease. This was taking place when the scientific community was trying to classify and create taxonomies for everything in the natural world: animals, plants, rocks, and languages. Many individuals contributed their own nosologies. Some were published in Latin and used as tools for instruction. The triggering event leading to the development of the first international classification of causes of death was the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was basically a large trade show held at the Crystal Palace in London. The statisticians' desire to compare industrial products at the Great Exhibition led to the first International Statistical Congress at Brussels in 1853. Moving forward to 1891, a committee was formed to develop a uniform classification of causes of death. The chairman of this committee was Jacques Bertillon, who was head of statistics for the village of Paris. In 1899, Bertillon's recommendations convinced the French government to convoke in Paris in August 1900 the first international conference for the revision of the Bertillon, or International Classification of Causes of Death, or ICD, as it subsequently became known. That first meeting was held in Paris. Imagine being in Paris in August 1900, 12 years after the Eiffel Tower was built, where the only international transport was by ship, and 12 years before the Titanic sank. Delegates from 26 countries came from around the world to discuss causes of death for 3 days. The purpose of the meeting was to come up with an agreed-upon classification that countries could use to compare reasons that people die. They assembled a list of 179 causes of death. Kim's dad probably would have been listed as acute nephritis with this list. The desirability of revisions every 10 years was recognized, and the French government convened conferences in 1910, 1920, 1929, and 1938. These conferences then became the origin of the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth classifications of causes of death. All of these meetings were held in Paris, and the French transcripts can be obtained at the WHO website. Included in the index is a list of the participants, which shows how individuals come year after year, how their responsibilities change, and which countries send the most number of people. Of special note is the attendance in Paris in 1938 by Friedrich Burgdorfer, whose French title translates to Director of the Demographic Section of the Office of Statistics for the German Reich. A Google search on his name pops up several of the articles that he wrote in the 1920s about the demographic time bomb in Germany caused by the low birth rate. He also penned an article about the influence of Jews on German demographics, and was instrumental in instituting a census of Jews in Germany and a census of Gypsies in Romania. After the war, he was forbidden from accepting academic appointments, but was honored for his demographic research up until his death in the 1960s. After World War II, the International Conference for the Sixth Revision of the International Lists of Diseases and Causes of Death was convened in Paris in April 1948 by the government of France. This conference was different from previous ones because it was tasked with developing a classification for diseases as well as causes of death. Therefore, the sixth classification became useful not only for medical examiners and those compiling statistics on deaths, but also for hospitals that were treating patients with diseases. The seventh meeting in 1955 was the last to take place in Paris. The 8th, 9th, and 10th revision meetings in 1965, 1979, and 1989 all took place in Geneva. These all resulted in classifications that were adapted for use in the U.S. A pioneer who used these classifications for reporting hospital statistics in the United States was Virgil Slee, who had started the Commission on Professional and Hospital Activities, or CPHA, in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1955. At one point, over 2,000 hospitals were reporting their discharges along with patient diseases and procedures. Virgil and his colleagues would provide their expertise in adapting the 7th, 8th, and 9th versions of ICD for use in U.S. hospitals. After the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services began to pay hospitals on the basis of ICD codes in 1983, responsibility for the updates to the procedure classification went to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and updates to the disease classification was with the National Center for Health Statistics. The statisticians and those who had relied on ICD codes in the past for research bemoaned the fact that their coding system had been repurposed for payment. The ICD-10 codes were released in 1992 and have been adopted by over 110 countries for reporting causes of death and adopted by about 25 countries for use in reimbursement and resource allocation. The Australian adaptation is ICD-10-AM. The Canadian one is ICD-10-CA. The German version is ICD-10-GM. And the American version, expected to be adopted in October of 2015 after several delays, will be ICD-10-CM. The ICD tradition has a long history that starts in the Middle Ages with the desire to count why people die and what can be done about it. Since that time, the classification system has evolved to provide data to analyze non-fatal diseases, patient outcomes, and healthcare costs. Despite these huge demands and deviations from the original purpose, the ICD remains the worldwide standard for reporting diseases and causes of death centuries after it was initially developed, and it is expected to continue for a long time to come. At the end of the day, the system merely facilitates the collection and analysis of data, which are simply patients with their tears wiped off.